Rosie Batty is an extraordinary person. She is a great Australian and she has suffered much, and she is determined to ensure that we don't just make a statement by appointing her Australian of the Year, but that we act as a nation to make a difference to reduce the scourge of domestic violence which is stalking too many households in our country. I'm the father of 3 daughters. I am the brother of 3 sisters. The last thing I want to see tolerated is violence against women and children. We know it happens. Something like 1 in 3 Australian women has suffered violence in a domestic context through her lifetime. Every week, 1 Australian woman dies as a result of domestic violence. Every year in Victoria, the police respond to some 60,000 incidents of domestic violence, and in New South Wales, some 40% of all police work is involved with domestic violence. So this is a very serious problem, and the government is determined to act this year to make a difference. It is going on the COAG agenda, and COAG will be asked to act urgently this year to finally agree on a national domestic violence order scheme, so that a domestic violence order in one jurisdiction holds in another jurisdiction. We all know that so many families do flee from city to city, from state to state, to avoid violence, and if they're fleeing violence, the violence should not be allowed to follow them. And that's why it's so important that we do have a national domestic violence order scheme. It's important also that we have uniform standards for dealing with these perpetrators, that we have appropriate red flags that appear in the case of people who are subject to domestic violence orders. And given that domestic violence and domestic persecution now takes many forms and uses modern technology, we want to try to ensure that there is online safety and that we protect women against these newer forms of abuse. So look, I thought it was a truly marvellous thing when Rosie Batty, who has suffered so much but who has responded so magnificently to an unimaginable tragedy, was made Australian of the Year, and I am determined that this won't simply be a statement, but it will mean action that will leave our country permanently a better place. Natalia?
Thank you, Prime Minister, and I'm delighted to be here today in my role as the Minister assisting the Prime Minister for Women to reaffirm the government's commitment, but not just the government's commitment. I believe it's the commitment of all Australians to an Australia where there is no violence against women and children. As the Prime Minister has said, and as I have said, it is our firm belief that violence against women and children is wrong, violence against women and children should not be tolerated, and we must do everything that we can to ensure that we live in an Australia where we are free from violence against women and children. As the Prime Minister said earlier this morning, we met with Rosie Batty, an Australian of the Year now, and a woman who suffered an unspeakable tragedy, but she drew on her inner strength to become what is now recognised as an inspirational campaigner in relation to ending the scourge of domestic violence. I'm delighted that Rosie has agreed to provide advice to us in relation to her unique experiences as an Australian who navigated the system. The system didn't necessarily help her, and we all know what actually occurred in the tragedy of her losing her son Luke. The government is taking the issue very seriously. We have committed $100 million over the forward estimates to tackle the scourge of domestic violence. You will be aware that in June of last year, the Prime Minister, myself and then Minister Andrews launched the second action plan under the National Action Plan to reduce violence against women and their children. The second action plan was based on extensive consultations with not just the state and territory governments, but with stakeholders across Australia who have for many, many, many years, if not decades, worked in this space. The second action plan is a collation of those action items which stakeholders, which states, which territories, which the Commonwealth Government have committed to as practical actions that we need to implement if we are to move forward in this space. So the announcement today, Prime Minister, that our COAG is now to have domestic violence as an agenda item, I think builds on the significant work that this government has done, is doing and will continue to do to ensure that we do move towards our goal as a government and as a nation in which all Australians live in a society that is free from violence.